Thank you everyone for joining me tonight. This is SP Guildhouse. We're going to talk about the Venezuela situation. So just to give a little bit of background, on the 3rd of January, the world was shaken by events. And on that day, United States launched a military strike on Venezuela and captured the incumbent Venezuelan president, Nicolás.
Kidnapped. Rather than captured. Kidnapped.
I'll explain why I use the word captured. Okay, so why this occurred, right? Because in 2011, the US Department of Justice indicted Maduro for charges of narco-terrorism. Okay, the charges filed were that the president of Venezuela and various senior Venezuelan officials conspired with Colombian guerrilla groups to traffic cocaine to the United States. So this is considered narco-terrorism in the US justice system. And then 2020, the Southern District of New York also filed charges against Maduro. So all that culminated in the operation known as, let me just click here, Operation Absolute Resolve. That was the name picked by the military to kidnap. And why I used the word captured earlier, because this is operation sanctioned by the Department of Justice, and so it is a legitimate capturing of a criminal in the eyes of the justice. So on that day, the president was captured along with his wife, and then currently is being held in the United States. Okay, coming back to this, my presentation, why do I say it's Western imperialism? You will see that actually there's been a history of expansionism and imperialism from the Western powers, and it's going to link back to something called the Monroe Doctrine, which I will explain in a while. Okay, if you look at the history of the Western world, even from as early as the 15th century, the Western powers have actually expanded into Americas, Asia, India, Africa, and all that. So why they did this is that they want to get resources, natural resources, bases, prestige, and then the missionaries, the Christian missionaries, impose their languages, English language, or French or Spanish, religions and governance onto other countries. In the eyes of the Europe, the other countries were savages. So let's go on. Now, all this culminated in what is called the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. Now, this picture only shows the British colonies' invasion into Canada. Of course, back then it wasn't known as Canada, but actually during that 7 years, it was a global conflict, okay? In Europe, Russia fought against Austria, France, Russia, cementing its place as a major power. In Northern America, Britain's victory in the French and Indian Wars secured Canada and dominance over the northern continent. In India, the Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked the beginning of British colonial supremacy in India. In the Caribbean and Africa, Britain seized sugar islands and trading posts. Is that someone? Okay. So the last point I put there, the Treaty of Paris, this was in 1763. We drew the map of the British Empire. Britain emerged as the preeminent global power. France was declining. I will explain why it was declining. And then, but in the new Americas, right, although Britain was conquering new land, it sowed discord among the American colonies, leading to the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. It is estimated that about 900,000 to 1.4 million people died in the 7 years there. Okay, excuse me. So, I mentioned about America, right? So there was an independence movement back then from 1775 to 1783, led by George Washington and the American separatists. And then from the late 18th century, late 18th century, a guy called Simon Bolivar. He was a Venezuelan military officer. He led what is many countries in South America to independence from the Spanish Empire. Back then, it was Bolivia, or what is today Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, to independence from the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire actually was fighting on a lot of fronts because Napoleon Bonaparte from 1808 to 1812 were fighting against the Spaniards. And then there was also a guy called Jose de San Martin. He fought against Portugal. So in the South Americas, a lot of the countries were gaining independence from the European powers. A lot of things were happening back in those days. Yeah. Of course, we had the American independence, 1783. So by the time of James Monroe, right, he was the 5th president of the United States. And then the era that back then was called the era of good feelings. And James Monroe, he actually freed Florida from Spain. That was called the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, same year that Singapore gained independence. And then also there was a lot of fighting from northern states and the southern states over slavery. The northern states wanted freedom for the slaves, but the southern states didn't want it. So a compromise was reached. It's called the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri was designated as a slave state and Maine as a free state. And then they had a policy of prohibiting slavery in the remaining Louisiana lands north of the 36th parallel. So that was before Lincoln and the Civil War. Excuse me. Okay, so in 1823, James Monroe issued a doctrine. It's a very important doctrine. He declared that the Western Hemisphere, which means Northern and Southern America, was closed off to further European colonization. Then any European interference in America will be considered a threat to US security. In return, the US pledged not to meddle in European affairs. So basically saying, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Yeah? It's significant because it symbolized a decisive break from centuries of Western imperialism. Before this, Europe and European powers were united, but the US chose to go separately from Europe, starting from the Monroe Doctrine. And so actually, you will come to what's called the Monroe Doctrine, yeah? It's very interesting. Okay, so of course, when I started the talk, we talked about Venezuela, and Donald Trump actually mentioned something called the Monroe Doctrine. But actually, it's not Monroe, it's Monroe. But Donald Trump wanted to put his own stamp on it, he called it Monroe. So you see that from James Monroe onwards, 1823, the subsequent presidents of the United States actually used his doctrine as justification for a lot of their foreign policies. So back in 1823, it was just a defensive doctrine. It says that, okay, Europe, you don't come here, we will leave you alone. Then Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 converted it to interventionist doctrine, and it justified the US policing of Latin America. So that was in 1904, Theodore Roosevelt. And JFK in 1962 used again the Monroe Doctrine to prevent Soviet military presence in Cuba. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the start of the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan, because starting from back then, Cold War, all the way to the 80s, right, US and Russia were at loggerheads. So Reagan used the Monroe Doctrine to counter Soviet influence in Central America which to me is very ironic because the CIA was helping the insurgents in Colombia, and they were financing a couple of drug lords there. So it's not so much a Soviet influence. Okay. And then finally we have Donald Trump, right? In 2026, he ran the Operation Absolute Resolve. It was supposedly to block China, Russia, and Iran influence. And then he called it the Monroe Doctrine. So, so that's the history of all the presidents. This slide is just to show you the conflicts in 2025, just last year alone. So the red areas are where conflicts have taken place, big and small. So I just want to show that actually the world today is a much more dangerous place compared to like 10 years or 15 years ago. It's just very confused and very fragmented. So just want to summarize and say that the doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, evolved from a defensive doctrine to interventionist, and it reflects US primacy in Western Hemisphere. Now, if you notice there's a little red circle at the top right, that is actually the part that Britain conquered Canada, and then I just want to show that actually from that small area expanded until the entire Western Hemisphere. So they claim guardianship over the whole of America, Northern and South America. So that's all I have for today. I shall now hand over the time to Han Shih, who will talk about Venezuela and what it means for small states like Singapore. Just a minute while I check the screen. It should show Han Shih face. Yeah. Let me make a full screen. It should be full screen. Okay, now yeah, go ahead, Han Shih.
Well, thanks a lot for allowing me to speak. This is Toh Han Shih from Singapore. I'm from Hong Kong. I'm a Singaporean. Alfred Hong has given a very good overview of the Monroe Doctrine and how it evolved till Trump with his Monroe Doctrine. I'll just expand on that a little bit. Many people, including the Singaporean government and Chinese government, were shocked and outraged and scared when, some months ago, Trump kidnapped Maduro and launched a commando raid on Venezuela. But and then he asserted primacy over the Panama as well. But actually, there's an interesting parallel to what Theodore Roosevelt did with both Venezuela and the Panama Canal as well, because in 1903, roughly 123 years ago, what Roosevelt did is he launched the building of the Panama Canal, and he tried to get the government of Colombia, which at that time controlled Panama, to sign an agreement for the U.S. to have a canal through Panama. The Colombian government refused, so Theodore Roosevelt landed American Marines in Panama, and the Colombian government couldn't resist. So Panama became an independent country, signed the Panama Canal Treaty with America, and allowed America a thin strip of land to build a canal. So that is an assertion of the Monroe Doctrine. And also related to that, around the same time, around 1903 or 1902, 1903, Venezuela had a debt crisis. They couldn't repay the governments of Italy, Britain, and Germany some debts they owed. So Britain, Germany, and Italy asserted their claims as creditors by sending warships over towards towards Venezuela, sorry. But what Roosevelt did is he sent the American Navy to threaten these European navies. And, basically the Italian, British, and German basically backed off. And that allowed, as Alfred pointed out, Roosevelt to have the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which became more active. The original Monroe Doctrine is a bit more passive, relatively speaking. But the Theodore Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine is a lot more active in that sense that it allows America to be a international police in the Western Hemisphere and occasionally intervene in some Latin American countries if necessary. But this ties up with the rise of America's military power, you see, because although President James Monroe launched the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, he couldn't always enforce it. I mean, from 1833 onwards, the British controlled the Falkland Islands in Argentina, and there was nothing the Americans could do about it because they were too weak to resist the British. It was around 1903 when Theodore Roosevelt was president. The American Navy became very powerful and they could, ward off the British, German, and Italian navies. So it's tied to military might. And I think that has a bit of a relevance to what's happening in Iran as well. Because, Trump right now has assembled a huge American armada and aircraft carriers off the coast of Iran. And he has threatened the Iranian government, saying that if they keep killing protesters, America will make them pay the penalty for it. But so far, nothing has really happened yet. And so there's been quite a delay for several weeks, and so far America has not launched any attack on Iran. And my guess is because Iran has some military power, it has missiles and has Houthi allies who have the ability to launch missiles at Israel and American military bases. And my guess is that the reason Donald Trump has held off from attacking Iran is because of the retaliatory power of the Iranians and their allies. So I think that's the same with the Monroe Doctrine. America can enforce the Monroe Doctrine only when it is powerful. So this is already happening even today. I mean, Trump's asserting control of the Panama Canal, and the Panama government just basically abrogated a treaty of Li Ka-shing, Hong Kong's richest man, in owning the ports on the Panama Canal. And the Chinese government complained and said they're going to protect the rights of Chinese companies, which is Li Ka-shing's company in the Panama Canal. And recently, Li Ka-shing company took the Panamanian government to some international arbitration court on this matter. But my guess is that this will be very ineffectual. Trump will ultimately have his way and control the Panama Canal. So what Trump is doing with Venezuela and Panama is exactly what Theodore Roosevelt did with Venezuela and Panama, in 1903, 1902, 1904, that era. And also, I mean, Trump recently went to a meeting in Davos, and like a real showman, he said he wants to get a deal on Greenland, and he wants greater American control over Greenland. And the head of the NATO, I think his name is Mark Rutte, appeared to agree with Trump on it. Now, this might sound very outrageous again, but I recently attended a talk in Hong Kong by a former American diplomat to the EU, and he said that Trump's methods are very unorthodox. But ultimately, what he did is just reflecting what previous administrations wanted. Even before Trump, previous American administrations already voiced concerns about Greenland being a conduit for Russia or Chinese influence, and they wanted greater control over Greenland. So Trump's doing what previous American presidents wanted to do. So basically, although Trump appears like a cowboy and a very unorthodox person, he's basically doing what American governments have been doing for the past, 100 or more years. Now that comes to Asia and Singapore, and how is this relevant to Singapore? I think some hints of what Trump will do are given in the new national security strategy and the new national defense strategy that was just recently published. Just Trump on the national defense strategy. Yeah. Yeah. Basically, the national defense strategy said that America will deter China in the Indo-Pacific through strength, not confrontation. President Trump, it said, seeks a stable peace, fair trade, and respectful relations with China, and he has shown that he's willing to engage President Xi Jinping directly to achieve those goals. But President Trump has also shown how important it is to negotiate from a position of strength. And then, America will support strategic stability with Beijing as well as deconfliction and de-escalation more generally. Our goal is not to, in doing so, is not to dominate China, nor is it to strangle or humiliate them. Rather, our goal is simple: to prevent anyone, including China, from being able to dominate us or our allies. So, I mean, this is both interesting news and good news for Singapore because I think Singapore government doesn't want any war between America and China, such as over Taiwan. And the new national defense strategy really lowers the probability of war between America and China in the Indo-Pacific, which is good for Singapore. But on the other hand, it says that they don't want to bully China, but they want to make sure China doesn't dominate or muscle out America's allies in the Indo-Pacific, which I presume is Singapore. So America will not be very happy if China becomes too dominant, say in the South China Sea or in the Malacca Straits. I mean, it's a fictitious hypothetical argument. If the China ever became so powerful they dominate and block off the Straits of Malacca, I think Trump will not stand for it, and he might resort to some tough actions to prevent that. And of course, the Singapore government also doesn't want that. The Singapore government doesn't want China to be that dominant. Um, so that's what we have. And also, the national security strategy, Trump said the way to do it is to continue his alliance with countries like India and the AUKUS Pact, which is Australia, UK, to strengthen their alliances against China. And it calls for more economic engagement with America's so-called allies in the Indo-Pacific, which I presume is Singapore, which means Trump wants to do more deals with Singapore and Malaysia regarding issues like rare earths. But I mean, you look at the way he's been doing it, it's really like kind of a bullying manner. I mean, the American ambassador to Singapore said Singapore must pay more for its share of America's economic benefits to Singapore. And the American ambassador to Singapore also said for some American celebration or something like that, they want each Singaporean company to come up and pay some money for it. I know for a fact a source close to the PAP, whom I will not name, has taken umbrage to this. So I suspect it has upset the Singapore leaders. So Trump, I think, is going to apply some strong arm tactics to get Singapore to do more deals with America. My guess is Trump will try to pressure Singapore government to buy more military weapons from America. I mean, which will boost the American economy. Um, the British historian Neil Ferguson said Donald Trump applies the Don Corleone doctrine, where he makes a deal with people you cannot refuse. And the Don only asks a favor once, If you refuse his favor, he will make you suffer, or he put a horse's head on your bed, as what happened in the Godfather movie.
Horse head
Um,
on it.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I don't think he'll do that to Singapore Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong, but, he might apply tariffs to Singapore. So then I want to come to one other point. You might think, Trump is just going to be strong in the Western Hemisphere and leave Indo-Pacific out. That's only partly true. I mean, what Trump has demonstrated in kidnapping Maduro is that he's willing to interfere in the domestic politics of a country. He's also threatened Iran, which is not in the Western Hemisphere, saying that if the Iranian government shoots the protesters, he will make them suffer. And recently also, Trump said that, if a certain Iraqi politician became the next prime minister of Iraq, America withdraw aid from Iraq. And the Iraqi government, I believe, complained and said this is an interference in Iraqi's domestic politics. So actually, to be very frank, I will not rule out the possibility that Trump in future might interfere in Singapore's domestic politics if Trump thinks that the Singapore government is getting too unfriendly to America, or if the Singapore government is getting too friendly to China for America's liking. I mean, Minister Shanmugam, the Home Minister Shanmugam already said that Singapore's politics should not have foreign interference. Singapore's politics are for Singaporeans to decide on. I'm a member of an opposition party, the Progress Singapore Party, and I agree with Shanmugam on that. I don't want foreign interference in my country. But having said that, we have to be realistic, and I think given the way Trump has been behaving towards Iran and Iraq, we cannot rule out the possibility that in future he might interfere in Singapore's politics. There you have it.